Hi, and welcome to Generation Cult, an interview show about people who grew up in isolated authoritarian groups, also known as cults, and what they did after they got out of their groups. I'm Deanna Levy, and today we're going to be speaking with Rhonda, who spent part of her childhood in an organization called the Holy Order of Mans. I hadn't heard of this one before, so it was so interesting to learn about it from Rhonda, whose parents did end up leaving the group, but kept within a New Age form of spirituality for the majority of her youth. Rhonda, welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me. I was raised in the Holy Order of Mans. My parents joined when I was just around 1 year old. That was 1970, and they left in 1980 when I was around 10. So I was definitely in it for all of my formative years, and children were not raised by their parents. We were raised by other people in the organization. So it definitely affected everything about who I am, I believe.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me about it today. Can you give me some history of the group? Where did it originate?
The history of it I find fascinating. It started in the late 60s in San Francisco, specifically in the Haight and Ashbury area. And it really grew from the whole 60s subculture happenings of the late 60s. So Earl Blyton, the leader who called himself Father Paul, started by having a little place on the Haight where he would help people who had become disillusioned with being a hippie and druggies that ended up homeless, and this whole migration of all these young people that ended up without families on the streets. And that's where he started, which was helping them. So it very much was a Californian new religious movement that was born out of that whole subculture.
Okay.
So I find that part absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And he, however, embraced a lot of the New Age part of the spiritual awakening of that time with energy and color and light and music and vibrations and reincarnation and chakras. But he also was completely against drugs. You couldn't drink, you couldn't listen to rock and roll. And he took the approach of having a very orderly, monastic, scholarly way of teaching all of his teachings. So he really took Christianity and many other religions, mixed them all together, tried to make it like a monastic school that you would be, learning everything that you were supposed to learn, that he had spelled out almost in a syllabus form, and somehow married it with all of these very esoteric ideas of spirituality. So I think that that's one reason that he was able to bring in so many of these young people that were in this subculture.
Something about it really reminds me of Theosophy, which is what I was raised in. There seems to be some parallels, the reincarnation, the esoteric methods. I mean, are you familiar with Theosophy at all? Have you heard of it?
Yes. So it's very interesting after listening to some of your podcasts and hearing your story and speaking to you. I went back and did a little more research. I have to give the credit to Philip Charles Lucas, who wrote a book about the Holy Order called The Odyssey of a New Religion. And I have read this book several times, but of course you remember, only certain things. And I went back and looked in there, and he actually listed Theosophy as one of Father Paul's inspirations, as well as Rosicrucianism and old Christianity and Gnosticism.
Huh.
So I actually found that really interesting. So Theosophy was something that Father Paul knew about and was inspired by, which also explains why the order put me into the Waldorf school, because Rudolf Steiner, who started Waldorf education, was also inspired by Theosophy. So it's kind of an interesting link there between all of those.
I know it's really been surprising to me how much Theosophy has affected other religions. Only recently did I start learning more about Rudolf Steiner, who was a Theosophist and then branched off from Theosophy and started his own thing. And then he's responsible for the Waldorf schools, which it sounds like you experienced yourself.
Yes, until 8th grade.
Till 8th grade. Okay.
Yeah, kindergarten to 8th.
So let's talk about your personal experience, or actually, let's start with your parents. Were both your parents involved in this group?
Yes. So I was born in Denver, and the night I was born, actually, my parents were at a meeting which the Holy Order of Mans didn't technically proselytize. They had meetings and classes, and then they had Sunday services, and that's how they brought people in. So my parents were at a class the night I was born, and my mother was actually having contractions and just kind of ignored them because she felt like the class was really important and she needed to finish the class. And then after the class, they went back to my grandparents' house where they were staying in the basement, and she gave birth to me in the basement with no doctor and
Oh,
no
wow.
midwife. And soon after that, they decided that they wanted to join the order. And the order was hesitant to let them in because they were a family. They really didn't like to have families and children because they really thought children were a distraction. So they didn't really want to let my parents in. But I did find letters that my mom had written saying, it's fine. Our daughter is spiritually and karmically linked to the order because she was almost born in our first class. And they eventually, within the year, did let them in. So they took a vow of poverty, which is what you had to do to become a young initiate. And they gave away everything they owned, and they moved from Denver to San Francisco. So that was about 1971. I was around 1 year old. And at that time, the men and women couldn't live together, and neither could the children. So my mom moved into the sister house, which was very close. It was on Steiner Street where the headquarters were. And my dad moved into the headquarters, and I went to a farm in Sebastopol, and I lived there until I was 3, till after I was 3. So my parents lived separately then as well, and they became initiates. And then, as I mentioned, all of the classes were laid out, almost like you were going to college, and here's your syllabus. And here's all the studies that you have to do. And so all the women lived together, all the men lived together. Part of the house of the men did domestic duties, and part of the house went out and worked. And then the same with the women. So they were living communally. Any money that was made by anybody was turned into the order, and then everybody was given a small stipend. It was very, very small. So domestic chores were all being completed by some people, and then some people would be working. Dad would say stuff like Father Paul would come in and shake it all up and tell you had to quit your job one day, and another person had to do the domestic chores. So that's how they ran. And then every morning at 6 a.m, they had services, they had meditations. Then some people would go off to work, and some people would do the domestic chores, and then they would study at night, and they had classes and their own readings they needed to do. And I mean, it was a lot of studying, a lot of extensive study. They read holy books from all different religions, the Quran, the Torah, Bhagavad Gita. They even had tests, they had papers they had to write. And then meanwhile, within living in the house, it was very strict. If you were a new initiate, you wore black clerics. All the women had their hair the same. All the men were very clean cut. They very much wanted to look like priests, and he was very adamant about them being very clean cut and neat and clean and orderly. Everybody looks the same. I mean, you look back at pictures of them and everybody's the same. And depending on what level of clothes you might wear. So I remember my parents for years only wore their black clerics. And then at some point, my dad was at a higher level and he had blue, and then there were some that had maroon, and then there was very few that wore white. So there was hierarchy steps in the initiation process. So that's why the children couldn't live with the adults, because they would have distracted them from all of that work.
And did your parents ever talk to you about that time? I mean, I'm sure you don't remember ages 1 through 3. So did your parents
Right.
ever talk to you about what it was like to send you off to a farm in Sebastopol when you were so young?
A little. I certainly don't remember ages 1 through 3. I clearly remember things at 3 and 4 and 5. But when I did confront my parents later, my mom, I don't know, she's not had a very open, she was not able to openly talk to me about a lot of it. I think it was too hard for her to accept. I think she felt really bad that she abandoned me, and it was very hard for her to accept that. And so she was not able to talk to me a lot about it. But there's a few stories that stick out, and one that really stuck out was she said when I was 3 and I was going to go live with them for a couple of months it was either Wichita or Fort Worth, and the order drove me to her in San Francisco. And she remembers when I got out of the car, they had pinned a note to my jacket that said I had been potty trained.
Mm.
So just little weird stories like that that show, just missing of this major childhood milestone, in my life, and her being like, "Oh, my child is potty trained now because there's a note pinned to her jacket." So there were a couple of little stories like that that she told me, and I did see them once in a while. I knew who they were. It wasn't like I didn't see them for so long that I had forgotten, which I've spoken to other children that I lived with back then, and one girl told me that she did not remember her dad, and when she went to go live again with her dad, she was terrified
Mm.
because she did not remember him.
So, how many children were going through this at this time?
So, I think the first farm I lived at and the second, it was always under 10 children. It wasn't a lot, I don't think, because of the fact that Father Paul was very resistant to even letting people in with children. And then once they were in, he was very resistant to even letting them have children, and they had to ask permission even if they wanted to get married. So I don't think there was a lot of children, but I could be wrong because people did come and go.
Mm.
But in the pictures that I have of me as a child, because they would take pictures and send them to my parents, and then my parents saved those pictures, and I have them now. There's usually under 10 children. At that time, we were all around the same age. We were all around 2 and 3 years old at that first farm.
Okay.
We were all very young.
So, it sounds like you went back to your parents when you were about 3. How long did that last?
Just a few months. We moved to Fort Worth, Texas for a little while because my dad had just been ordained as a priest and he was opening a new mission house because the order was growing really fast at that time. And then we moved to Wichita, Kansas. I'm not even sure why we moved there and for how long we lived there, but it wasn't very long because I was already 3 when I moved back in with them for a little while and then turned 4. And then that's when they took me back to California. And I went to another farm, which it was the same Orders farm. They had just moved it from Sebastopol to Petaluma.
Mm.
And so I had only lived with them for a few months in between. Then I clearly remember them taking me back to the farm. And because I remember being 4 years old and us going and them not really explaining what we were doing. And I remember walking into the room and seeing all of the furniture. That was all the small kid furniture that I used to live with. So even though I didn't recall actually being 2 and 3 years old, I remember at that moment recognizing the furniture. It looks like a preschool. There was all these small little round tables with little chairs around it. And I remember thinking, oh, I know what's going on here. And that's when they dropped me off the second time, which I definitely remember clearly. And that was very damaging. Although I feel like the first time was very damaging on a biological, developmental level of not having your own parents raise you. The second time, I think, was more damaging on an emotional level because in my mind, how I remember it, I feel like nobody explained anything to me or even prepared me for what was going to happen. I just feel like they took me there and they were like, here's your new caretakers, here's your new house, we'll see you later.
Yeah, that sounds really unsettling. Do you remember anything about that time, like the other kids there or like the people who cared for you?
I do. We had, there was a couple that was married that cared for us. And then there was, as I recall, 3 other adults that were all single and they traded off taking care of us. And it was a farm. We had cows, chickens, we had a pony, we had 2 peacocks. I was the youngest of the kids, so I was 4 years old. And there were a few other girls that were around 6 and then 2 girls that were 8. And one of them was like the ringleader. And I remember not liking her at all and thinking that she was very mean
Mm.
and was definitely the one in control. And I remember a lot of times where there was no adults around. Like, I think they just were like, oh, let the kids play. And so we were kind of left to our own devices, which really left a lot of time for the ringleader to be mean. And I don't remember them having a lot of interactions and stopping her from being mean. And so I just remember like not wanting to play with them a lot and wanting to spend a lot of time alone. However, one of the girls had Down syndrome and she was so incredibly sweet. I do remember being friends with her, but I also don't remember her being there the whole time. So I don't know if she left at some point. But overall, I remember really wanting to spend a lot of time alone and just hanging out outside, climbing the trees and in the fields and whatnot, and just trying to stay away from the mean girls.
Part of that sounds idyllic on the surface. I mean, you're in a farm, you're running around, you're with other kids, but yeah, the whole separation from parents thing, that can be so damaging, and especially if you don't even know what's going on.
Absolutely. And I've heard in a few of your other interviews, as well as your own story, that really rang true to me, that a lot of these stories have good and bad.
Exactly.
And it's not entirely bad, because the order went and even built these giant play structures for us. And I remember telling people later in my life, oh, these play structures, you wouldn't believe them. The slide was taller than the house. When we were up on top of the slide, I remember you could look down on the roof of the house, and like 5 of us could sit together and hold hands and slide at once. And people would say, oh, you're not remembering that correctly. There's no way anyone would ever do that. It's so dangerous. Well, I went back and found that house a few years ago and spoke to the man who owned it. And he actually told me that he bought it from the order. And he was like, there were these giant, dangerous play structures in the backyard. And he completely confirmed these memories. So there was this whole weird, I call it a balance of neglect and being spoiled, because on the one hand, I did have this idyllic, like going out and having, these huge swings to swing on and a giant sandbox and, wonderful slide. And, my job was to get the eggs from the chickens in the morning, and we'd milk the cows and, run through the fields, and the cows would chase us. And we had a pony, I
Yeah,
mean,
I want a pony.
society
Yeah.
tells us that, yeah, that every, little girl wanted a pony back in the 80s or whatever. We had a pony we could ride. And, so much of that is in my personality now. Like, I love nature. I feel claustrophobic in the city. I need to be outdoors all the time. So I don't know, nature versus nurture. Is that who I am? Was I born that way? And I just happened to be able to live in nature, or did it create me that way? Did it make me want to be in nature? But that part of it was amazing, and I loved it. And I even remember when we moved into an apartment when I was 5, like distinctly being anxious because of the sounds of all the people around us, and the sounds of the city, and not nature. So that part of it was ideal and beautiful, but not being raised by your parents, having your attachment to them, the bond broken, is probably one of the worst things for your development as a child.
And were they introducing the order's form of spirituality? Like, were you introduced to the ideology when you were young?
Yes, we were introduced to it. We had services every Sunday. I definitely had my parents telling me things. I was completely aware of the light. Everything was about the light and raising your vibrations. So, even at a young age, I was very aware of that. They weren't sitting us down and schooling us day in, day out in that way, as I've heard other organizations, but we were definitely being taught everything. My aunt said when I was 5 or 6 and I got to visit her, I looked at her straight on and said, "You don't have the light, do you?"
Mm. Aw.
And I obviously had some sort of indoctrination. And in my mind, it was probably because she wasn't wearing clerics. She
Mm.
wasn't dressed all in black like everybody in the order.
'Cause she wasn't part of the order.
Right, because she wasn't in it. So that was probably what I was thinking was, oh, you're not dressed all in black, so you're not part of these light people over here.
Mm.
But I found pictures that I had drawn, they had sent to my Nana, and I drew quite a few pictures of the symbolism from the order. I'm not even sure exactly which colors were related, but they had a square with a triangle inside of it, with a circle, with a cross, and then every shape was associated with a color, and then it all had a symbolism, and it was attached to the acronym of MANS, and it all had to do with different spiritual levels and whatnot. And in my art as a very young child, I had a lot of those symbols, so I was definitely aware of what they were teaching us. I knew that Jesus was a big part of it, and I knew that the light. My mom used to tell me, when you close your eyes at night, you have to make sure that there's light dancing on the back of your eyelids. and you can't lose that light. And so you have to focus on that light every single night. So I would do that every night. I would be afraid of what would happen if I lost the light.
And it sounds like Christianity was incorporated into this, which I don't want to say it's unusual, but I guess when I think of, New Age, hippie communes, I guess some of them have a Bible-based aspect. But when I think of my own, we didn't have much Christianity, at least in my particular group, involved. Was that a big part of it for you?
It really was. I mean, in my mind, the base of it is Christianity. And according to Philip Charles Lucas and the studies that he did of Earl Blyton before he started the order and before he became Father Paul, some of his influence came from a Christian yoga church in San Francisco. So he had already been influenced by somebody who was mixing these Eastern and Western, or I guess I don't even want to define it that way, but someone who had been mixing ideologies.
Okay.
So in my mind, it was kind of a skeleton of Christianity and an outline of Christianity with very almost Catholic rituals, and then sprinkled and strewn with all of these other ideas that he got from other religions. When we had communion, if we had a church service and had communion, it was very much a Christian ritual with candles being lit, drinking the blood of Christ and eating. I mean, all of that ritual is very similar. It's just that it happened always in a chapel that was in our house, or was a chapel that the order had. There wasn't ever a church, because Father Paul, in his writings, he felt like the churches were failing people because they weren't moving spirituality fast enough. They weren't lifting people's vibrations fast enough. So they were, I guess, letting society down because they weren't intense enough or fast enough. So definitely had that Christian outline, but he also at the same time was trying to do it differently than the churches.
Is this still around?
So the last time I really did some deep digging, it had pretty much split into about 5 different groups, and there were still some sort of remnant in the 5 different groups. However, nothing is the same as it was, because when he died in 1974, things started to change. And then, of course, it drastically changed after the Jonestown massacre in 78. And the leader at that time actually changed it into a completely different organization, and it pretty much became an Orthodox Christian church, and they dropped all of the New Age elements of it.
And that was because of Jonestown?
Yes, it was a direct result. I mean, I guess at that time, people were still saying new religious movements, but it happened because, I mean, up until that point, they were getting positive write-ups in the paper, and they were getting really good press because they did a lot of good things. They started a domestic violence shelter. They had, homeless shelters. They had all sorts of organizations that were really helping people. So after Jonestown, the media and everything just turned on these new religious movements, and there was a direct connection between the order and Jonestown People's Temple because they both had headquarters in San Francisco.
Oh.
So if you're looking at the larger picture of California, new religious movements, you've got
Jim Jones.
Jim Jones, yeah. So he was really active in San Francisco. He was very active in politics, and
he got good press too. Like the People's Temple
yeah,
got really, I mean, they were out in the community helping people too. Like nobody seems to remember that because of the huge, horrible tragedy that happened. But yeah.
absolutely. And he was very active in politics, and at some point had a job in politics and was like friends with Harvey Milk, and
yeah,
was very high up in San Francisco. And at one point, one of his headquarters and the order's headquarters, no, it wasn't the order's headquarters, it was their sister house, got firebombed.
Oh.
And they got together and started a commission with these other religious churches that had been firebombed, and got together and like made this commission to be like, what are we going to do about this? How do we stop this? So there was a direct link between the order and the People's Temple. And so immediately when the Jonestown massacre happened, all of these families that were mourning the loss of someone that had been in the Jonestown massacre, like descended on San Francisco and was demanding answers and who do we sue? And so the press just turned against like all the new religious movements at that time. And all of a sudden, that's when cult
Yeah.
started to be used, and the order was now a cult. And the person who was the director general of the order at that time, he came from a more orthodox background. And so I think he did whatever he thought he needed to do to get the press to look at them like they were quote unquote normal and we're just
Yeah.
a church here and we're not a cult, and took it in that direction. And then at some point changed their name to Christ the Savior Brotherhood, became completely orthodox, became an unrecognizable organization. And then around that time, Mother Ruth, who had been married to Father Paul, she started her own kind of offshoot where she was trying to really preserve the original teachings of Father Paul. And she moved to Oregon and kept her organization going. So those two offshoots kept going. And then the domestic violence shelter that they had started in San Francisco, which is called Raphael House, it became its own nonprofit and it is still there today. So there's definitely 3 offshoots that then became other organizations.
I'm curious what your whole relationship was to all of this that happened, Jonestown, the divides, the changes. How old were you when all of this was happening, and how did you and your parents react?
Well, yeah, that's the interesting part. So I was completely unaware of all of this. We were raised on a farm. We didn't have a TV. We never went anywhere. We didn't see movies. I was completely sheltered from society. And when I actually did move in with my parents when I was 5 years old, they continued in that vein. We didn't have a TV. We didn't go to movies. So I had no recollection or idea what was going on in society greater than the order. Later, when I went back and started researching all of this, started putting it together and could look and go, okay, in 1978, that's right when my sister was born, literally a week after her birth was Jonestown. So in our little world, we're completely sheltered. I have a new sister. And then soon after that, my parents started talking about leaving the order. And then within a year, they got out. They had to borrow money to buy a house when I was 10. And so in my little world, all I knew is they were talking about leaving. They borrowed money, got a house, and we got out. And then later I went back and looked at all of the dates and the research and everything. It was like, oh, it makes perfect sense at that time. That's why he was complaining about the order changing, because the order was changing because of Jonestown. And I just found that interesting, but
Yeah.
I had no concept of any of it at the time. All I had was a concept of what my parents were telling me.
Yeah. And how old were you when the Jonestown thing happened and then your parents left?
So I was 8.
Okay.
I had just turned 8.
And were you living with them, or were you
Yes.
on a farm?
So I left the farm Christmas Eve of when I was 5 years old. I had just turned 5, and we moved into an apartment on Highway 101 in San Rafael. And we were still a part of the order. They were very much in control of our finances. I remember we didn't have a car, and I remember when my dad was really excited and said, hey, the order got us a car. So they were just at a high enough level at that time that they could move out and be a family, because my mom was pregnant with my sister. So at that time in 1975, the order must have had between 60 and 70 mission houses at that point. So they were all over the US in almost all 50 states. They had 60 some mission houses. So they were able to still keep control of everybody, even though everyone wasn't living together communally,
Okay.
which I also think is a very interesting point, because sometimes people think you have to live together in order to have a cult. But
No. I assume you remember that time.
I do. I absolutely remember. I remember them picking me up on Christmas Eve, and we moved into our apartment. And right after that, my mom told me she was pregnant. She was going to have a baby, and my sister was born by June. So I already was having some troubles, being a little resentful of getting my parents back and then a baby coming. So that was a bit difficult for me.
What was your schooling like?
So at that point, I had started off at the Waldorf School in Santa Rosa. And when we moved to San Rafael for a brief time, I was in the Waldorf school up there.
They're still popular today, the Waldorf schools.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the school that I went to in Santa Rosa, when I started, it was like 2 classrooms in rented churches and moved every year. And now it's like this giant, amazing place. So they've definitely grown in popularity. But yeah, we were just briefly in San Rafael at that Waldorf school. And then we soon after moved to Santa Rosa, and we moved into a really large house with other order members. So it was another family that had kids and us, and then another single sister, as they called them. And we all lived together for like a year or two. And that's when I went back to the Santa Rosa Waldorf school where I had been before. And I remember all of that because I met my best friend there. So we were still in the order. By then I was like 7. And then 7 and 8, we moved into another house. When I was 8, that's when we were finally alone, as far as it just being our family. But we were still in the order. We still had a room that had our altar set up, that we had Sunday services. It was our chapel. And my parents gave classes in the living room. My mom used to teach tarot. And then that's when my sister was born, which was 1978. A week later, Jonestown happened. And it was right after that my parents were talking about leaving. And then they were able to fully get out and be financially free. So that's when we were completely finished with the order.
And did you guys fully leave the space? Like, did you move to another area, or did you just stop attending services?
We just moved across town. It was still in Santa Rosa. It was just across town. They bought a house. And, it was interesting because my parents had a chapel, and it always was set up exactly how it was in the order. And we always did Sunday service, but they just weren't in the order anymore. And I did talk to my dad about it later. And it was simply because Father Paul had died, and my dad didn't agree with the direction that the new directors were taking it. And so I don't know what would have happened if Father Paul hadn't died, or if it hadn't changed. I don't know how long we would have stayed in it. But in my mind, my dad still has those beliefs. Like, it wasn't that he lost any sort of belief in what they were doing. It just was that it changed, and that wasn't what he was into.
So what did your parents get into after that?
So then it was quite a stark difference. It was Northern California, 1980, and they met new friends, and they were all very new age. I just remember people coming to our house with flowing rainbow scarves and crystals, and everybody would sit on the ground and they would smoke pot, and they'd turn out the lights and listen to music and talk about raising vibrations. And there was it was all stuff that the order believed in too, color and light and music all being related. And, how do you raise the vibrations of a person or a place using color, light, and music? The main difference is that the order did not believe in drugs. And now all of a sudden my parents were smoking a lot of pot. And so that was really quite different in my mind. It was like, oh, all of a sudden we have all of these colorful people around our house. Everybody was an artist or a musician, or everyone was working on something. They all had some big grand plan that they were doing, and everything was about transcendental. And
Oh, were they into transcendental meditation?
I think some of them were. It was like all about meditation and lifting vibrations. I mean, there was one man who made a mandala machine. It was made out of light, and the light would change color to the music. And there were painters that had this amazing new age art of like beings ascending into colorful rainbows of otherworldly dimensions. And my dad, he turned the bedroom into a recording studio and became a new age artist. And, all of a sudden his music was being played on the Hearts of Space, and we were sending out tapes to people
that's
who were
cool.
ordering tapes.
I mean, that sounds somewhat delightful, to be honest. Like, what did you think during that period as a kid? Were you kind of enjoying the differences, or did you think it was weird? Like, what do you remember kind of going through your mind during that time?
It was both. Again, It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was beautiful, and I loved the art that the painters were putting out. I loved the lady who sold the crystals out of her trunk in her car, and she just seemed mystical. And And I loved the music, and they would put on healing light shows, and I would sell snacks at the, vending, it's just like a lot of it I did love. But on the other hand, I felt like our dad never paid any attention to us because he had a full-time job. And then the rest of his time he spent in his recording studio. And so he never played with us, and he never paid attention to us, and we didn't spend any time with him. And I also felt very weird. I mean, our house was not only a hoarder's disaster mess, but it also was, the living room was filled with giant computers and piano and stacks of music. And the bedroom was full of recording equipment. And our canning shed was a chapel. And I definitely knew that we were weird and different. And I didn't want friends to come over, and I didn't want them to see our house. And I was embarrassed by it.
Yeah, I was curious about that. I was wondering, how that affected your relationship with other children. Like if they saw this and thought it was cool or thought it was weird, or if you just completely hid it.
Yeah, I mean, my friends in the Waldorf school definitely had a higher threshold for what is strange, because there was a lot of things that were different about the families in Waldorf schools. And so I didn't feel as much judgment from my best friends could come over, and I didn't feel that much judgment from them. But there were definitely friends in the Waldorf school that seemed very normal. Like if I went to their house and I saw that they seemed completely normal, quote unquote, I wouldn't want them to come over. And then certainly never anybody from outside, like my ballet or gymnastics class.
And what did you consider normal at that time?
I mean, what I considered normal at that time was from the small glimpses of TV and movies that I had seen. And it was usually, a house that was orderly, had a nice living room and a family room, had parents that dressed normally. I mean, the first 10 years of my life, they wore clerics and dressed the same as every other person I'd ever seen, in black and blue. And then now all of a sudden they were wearing these long gowns, grew out their hair and looked like hippies, and had these people with rainbow scarves and stuff. Never had I just seen them dress in normal clothes as I saw reflected in the little bit of, media that I did see, or just going to the mall. I could see what people looked like, and they certainly did not ever look like my parents. So I did have a concept of what was quote unquote normal. And I longed for the neighborhood where your school is down the street and you ride a school bus and everybody's friends and they know each other. And, that's what I pictured was normal. It certainly wasn't a bunch of people sitting around in a circle on the floor smoking pot with the mandala machine going and dancing to the light of the movie Blues. I mean...
So at what point do you feel like you kind of broke away from your parents' circles?
Definitely as a teenager. They moved us to Colorado in the mid-'80s, and I had tried to make friends, and I had told some of my friends stories of California, and one of my friends informed me that they thought I was a pathological liar.
Oh, no.
And so that's when I really, truly realized that I couldn't tell anybody this past had happened, and I really kind of became two people. So there was the person that grew up in California and had all these experiences, and then there was this new person that was in Colorado and was going to try desperately to fit in. And so I stopped telling people any of the stories, and I internalized everything. And then I just really started to act out, because I haven't really explained that over the course of all of this upbringing, my father had really instilled in me what he believed was evil and wasn't evil. And a lot of the things that he classified as evil, a lot of the music and whatnot in society, a lot of the things that he said were evil, I really liked. So at that point, I was very angry with my parents, and I felt very split from them. I was very mad that they moved me to Colorado. And so my split happened in that I just embraced being evil. And I was like, well, I guess I'm evil. So
and what did they consider evil?
It was specific music. That was the most powerful thing to me, but also other things. I mean, my dad would go on long diatribe explanations of punk rockers were evil. So if I had a friend with a blue mohawk, they were evil, and or not necessarily evil, but a symbol of deterioration in society. And but specifically the music, specifically so much of my music that I loved. Later, when I was a teenager, he would do declarations. Like my sisters and I would remember specific ones. Like we remember one very clearly where he typed out Cyndi Lauper, Prince, and Michael Jackson are all declared evil and will not be played in this house. And that was a declaration that was pasted on the refrigerator one day. And
that goes against everything the 80s stands for.
I know. So there were specific ones like that. Like I wasn't truly that hurt with Michael Jackson. I wasn't into Michael Jackson, but I absolutely loved Cyndi Lauper. And it hurt to be like she was declared evil. And
what's wrong with Cyndi Lauper?
I know. It all comes down to the vibrations. And my dad has books about it. He's written books in it, and it's hard to understand. I remember my very favorite song, "Oh, Mickey, You're So Fine," and him flipping through the radio one day, which I don't know why we were listening to it because we weren't allowed to listen to it. And he specifically went off about how that was an evil song. So there were specifics, and my favorite that I got into from a babysitter was Pat Benatar. And I absolutely knew that my dad, I don't remember if he declared Pat Benatar evil or if I just absolutely knew that he would think she was evil. That really is my dad's main mission in life, and he still is working on that, and that is what he does, is he talks and teaches about why these vibrations are negative. So mostly all from the music, that if I loved all of this music, but there was also other elements of society that I loved, TV being one as well. I loved TV.
I still love TV.
Yeah, so I just embraced it and became a very unruly teenager.
So you decided, well, if this stuff is evil, then I guess I'm evil and I'm just gonna go with it.
Yeah. And I just went with it, and I was not a good teenager. I just did a lot of drugs and a lot of drinking and steal cars at night.
Wow.
Yeah. Had a lot of fun, did a lot of damage to my body.
Did your parents know about this? Like, what was their reaction?
Yeah, so there was a few times in Colorado between, me moving there at 15 and moving out at 17, where I don't remember specifically what had happened, but my dad had a few explosions where he would yell at me and say, "You just are doing all of this because of the farm, and you're mad at us about the farm." And I just was shut down and couldn't talk about it. And certainly being screamed at about it wasn't going to help any sort of dialogue happen. And looking back on it now, he was absolutely right. I was mad about the farm and acting out about the farm, but I had no idea how to even process that because I had shut all of that part away from myself. I'd completely shut it out because what was the point of it if talking about it made my friends think that I was a pathological liar? So I now understand it after going to school for early childhood education. And I understand now that as a child, I couldn't process emotion. And so as a child, I was completely aware of everything that was happening around me, but was not reacting to it. And so on the surface, you would have seen a very calm child, but underneath was a turbulent hurricane of emotion. And so growing up with that and then not dealing with it, sometimes I would just have like outbursts from holding all of that emotion in. And also that was the way my father would, have these outbursts where he would just declare his feelings. And so nothing was ever addressed in a healthy manner. I had no language or emotional capacity to deal with any of the feelings that I was feeling. And then on top of it, when I was 15 and I started drinking, memories would start flowing out of me. And I'd be at a party with like a bunch of 16-year-olds and I would go outside and sob. I remember some poor 16-year-old boy or whoever was around all of a sudden getting the brunt of me, like all of a sudden trying to like tell them stuff and them just being like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So mentally and emotionally, I do believe that I was a mess. And I don't believe that my parents could figure out the right way to address it.
So at what point did you start addressing this? What ended up helping you?
I started addressing it. I was 20 years old and I quit drinking because I was an absolute mess. I had done so much drinking and drugs by the time I was 20. I just completely quit everything and decided that if I had been evil and evil had led me to be doing all of that, needed to quit all of that and stop being evil. And I started going to church. And then that's when I realized that Christianity was not for me, because I actually went to church and started reading the Bible. And I was like, oh, I don't like this at all. So this isn't for me. This isn't going to help me not be evil anymore. And I just continued on a spiritual search then, and really went into a bunch of different, religions or spiritualities and exploring. And one of the first healing things I started to do, I had moved to New Mexico, and I went to a Native American healer who did like a vibrational healing. And that was one of the first things I really started to do that actually really helped me. And he helped me explore a lot of the negative music stuff and was helping me to let go. So on a spiritual level, I really started to work on all of that, thinking I was evil and accepting that I wasn't, and that I was a good person. And I actually didn't start getting therapy until I was 29. And that's when I went back to college. And in college, you get health insurance through the college and you get free therapy. And I was actually lucky enough to get a therapist who specialized in cults, and she helped me for a few years.
That's great.
And then that is really when I started going back and also researching the Holy Order, and confronted both of my parents and was basically like, why did you do that? And my mom had a really hard time talking about it, but she did say she was sorry and she wishes that she hadn't abandoned me, that she had felt at the time that she was afraid my dad would leave her and she didn't know how she could raise a child on her own.
Are they still together now?
No.
Okay.
They divorced when I was about 25.
So your mom's kind of come to terms with what happened. Have you gotten the chance to talk to your dad about it? Or
I mean, I don't even know if my mom truly has come to terms, but she did feel very bad about it. My dad said he was sorry that I was hurt while he was doing the important work. So that really didn't feel like the apology that I wanted at the time.
No.
I realized at that point I was never going to get the validation that I wanted.
So what brought you to me? What made you want to come and talk about it on the show?
What really brought me around, I forget who it was. It was your first episode in season 2. She said she went through a phase where she had to categorize her memories. And that rang so true to me. I went through a phase where I had to categorize my memories because I was diagnosed with cancer. And I realized that all of these people around me that were really close in my life actually didn't even know everything about how I'd grown up, including my own sisters, because they were so young when my parents got out of the order that their experience growing up didn't have anything to do with the order. It only had to do with some of the residual beliefs that held on to our family. And so I love taking that term. I wanted to categorize my memories so that the people around me would know them. And I started writing a book about the order. And I also wrote a rock opera about it. So I was really thinking, I was like, okay, I've got my rock opera done. Like, I need to somehow get out there. And I had come across your podcast and was so delighted in seeing that it was specifically for children that had grown up in these organizations. And once I had started listening to it, I was like, this is like a support group for me. It's healing to hear them say things that you can relate to.
I'm so glad that it was helpful.
Yeah, it was a mixture of all of that, of like, oh, okay, well, I need to start getting out there if I'm really going to do anything with my book and my rock opera. And here's actually a podcast that directly relates to my story.
What's your rock opera called?
It's called The Psychic Implications of White Sugar. It's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But the white sugar is Christianity, and it's the psychic implications of it. And it's about the lack of a good female archetype in Christianity, mixed with my own hurt from being abandoned. But how I've tried to portray it is, if people had their own thing that they were bringing to it, like say their family, didn't accept them for truly who they were, they would be able to relate to my rock opera, because it's in the core about not being accepted for who you truly are. And I've played it for family and friends, and that's it. I don't know what else to do with it at this point.
And how is your health? You mentioned that you were diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah, so I technically have stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. However, for having that dire of a diagnosis, I'm doing absolutely amazing. I've been stable for a few years now. So that really was the impetus for wanting to just get this all out there.
Yeah.
However, I have been lucky enough to buy myself some time and I'm doing great.
Well, I'm glad you're feeling good now. And thank you so much for being willing to speak so openly about your experiences.
Yeah, well, I'm appreciative that there's people out there that are even interested because it's kind of hard to go through life having this whole other side of you that you either feel like nobody's interested in or they can't understand,
Yeah.
or like, when do you even bring it up to tell them?
Yeah.
And so it's really like having this huge part of yourself that isn't even validated or seen.
I relate to that. And the more people I talk to, the more I realize this isn't super unusual. Like, people go through things like this and they're embarrassed to talk about it, or they don't feel like people understand. But I think if everyone was so open, then it would maybe be looked at as a less, I don't know, strange thing to go through.
Right. There has been a lot of people that have grown up in a fringe group.
Well, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. For more information about Generation Cult and our guests, as well as to see photos, hear some short clips of episodes, get some updates, we are on Facebook and Twitter at Generation Cult. You can also reach out to us by sending an email to generationcult@gmail.com. We are wrapping up season 3 and would love to hear what you think. Generation Cult is produced and hosted by me, Deanna Levy, with original music by Leanne Dunn and opening and closing music by the band The Chaw. See you next time!